I have the pleasure of talking about Ruth this morning, and even though my heading says Naomi, what a story, I'm doing an overview today on the 4 chapters of Ruth, and you'll be pleased to know it is just setting the scene. It's not actually going through all 4 chapters in 30 minutes, but that is what Gary's going to be doing for the next 4 weeks. He'll be looking at each chapter in turn. So I'm going to be setting the scene for today. It might help if I turn this on. Oops, there we go. All right, that didn't work. No. Right, well, this is an excellent start. But I'm not yet ready to do a tap dance. Yep, that's about it. Surprise. Okay, that's probably good. One less piece of equipment for me to have to rely on. The Book of Ruth. The authorship of Ruth is actually not clear, but there is talk that it could be Samuel. Maybe Samuel wrote the Book of Ruth. And one of the reasons that it's thought to be Samuel is that in the genealogy, which I'm going to be referring to soon, David gets mentioned, but Solomon doesn't. So Samuel obviously was around at the time of David. The story of Ruth begins and ends in Bethlehem. One of the things I love about Ruth is that I'm going to be showing you a video in a little bit, which is done by Bible Project, and it gives a beautiful overview summary of the 4 chapters. And I love it personally when things just sort of seem to fit in, and life actually is not perfect and doesn't fit in, but there is a tapestry being woven. And for the tapestry of the Book of Ruth, it actually starts in Bethlehem and ends in Bethlehem, which ironically is the hometown of David and was the birthplace of Jesus. They're just little things that I quite like and think, wow, you know, God's plan is amazing. The Book of Ruth is set once they leave Bethlehem, then they go to Moab. And the history of Moab is really, really interesting in contrast. I'm not expecting you to be able to read what I have on the board, although that's probably better. The creation of Moab actually came from Lot and his oldest daughter. So I'm not going to go into the story of Lot, but Lot ended up having children with both of his daughters. So coming out of an incestuous relationship, the child was called Moab, and that was actually the beginning of the Moabites. So straight out, there's a bit of an environment there that's actually not lovely and beautiful and perfect. And I've given you the from Genesis there. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab, and the father of the Moabites of today. Now, the history of Moab and the Moabite reputation continues. It doesn't get better. Can I just give you a heads up on that one? First of all, the Moabites didn't have a good reputation, and Solomon having many, many wives, and he was not meant to be marrying outside his tribe, but he had many, many wives, of which some of them were Moabites. And those wives were part of his downfall towards the end. The Moab King, there's a story there in 2 Kings 3, where one of the Moabite kings, in an effort to just please what he thought pleased God, was to actually sacrifice his son on the walls of his castle there. So the verse there from 2 Kings chapter 3. When the king of Moab saw that the battle had gone against him, He took with him 700 swordsmen to break through to the king of Edom, but they failed. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall. The fury against Israel was great. They withdrew and returned to their own land. So we're not painting a very good picture of the Moabites here. But it goes on. There's more. And you're not getting the steak knives too. And there are plenty more, but I've just picked out 3 that I think are pretty sort of pertinent in the Bible. The Moabite women were leading the Israeli men to idolatry. So, verse there from Numbers, chapter 25. When Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to commit sexual immorality with the daughters of Moab. These women invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods. Then the people ate and bowed down to their gods. When Israel joined themselves to Baal Peor, the anger of the Lord flared up against Israel. So, Moabites were actually people, a group of people you were not to go near. You were to avoid at all costs. And with their history and their not worshipping of God and not following God's call, it's not setting a very good picture here. Now, the Book of Ruth comes in the Bible between Judges, which talks heavily about anarchy, and the book of 1 Samuel. So the Book of Ruth, I think, also fits really snugly into the books of the Bible in that we've got Judges, which is talking all about anarchy and crush, kill, destroy. I have to say, sometimes when I'm not in the mood, I just sort of skip through parts of Judges because I'm getting the impression that really it was an awful place to be. And then we get Ruth, which can come across as a really beautiful love story, which it is, but there's actually more to it. It's not just a lovely romantic story where girl meets boy, they live happily ever after. There's actually a greater depth to it. And I think it's a lovely break. If you're reading through the Bible in the order of the books, Ruth is a lovely time to catch your breath and just see another side of God. And then the books after Ruth are 1 Samuel, which is where we start to talk about monarchy and the first king. Now, the very first verse in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, refers to the anarchy. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. Sorry, I'm doing this without my glasses. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of the 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now that in itself is the beginning of Ruth, but it tells us what desperation that family must have had to move to a place called Moab, where I've just explained the atrocities that they had. But clearly this family was desperate. It does say there the judges were ruling, there was a famine, so it would have been dark times. And then the very last verse in Ruth, before you launch into the monarchy, is stating Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David. And if you're aware of where David comes and what sort of a man David was, he was the first king. He was a man after God's heart. I just think Ruth starts by describing quite a sad situation and the desperation, and ends with this glimmer of hope. And that happens sort of towards the end of that sort of happily ever after story. Now, there are 4 chapters in the Book of Ruth, and each one of them talks about somebody. It starts virtually with somebody in need, and each chapter, throughout that chapter, it prompts a response. Okay? And it also seems that the last piece of, say, chapter 1 leads really smoothly, that theme leads into the beginning of chapter 2. And likewise the end of chapter 2 into chapter 3. I'm not going to talk much more about that to highlight that. That's going to come from the next few weeks as we delve into each chapter individually. But it's a really interesting tie where the end of one chapter just goes into the next. The very first chapter refers to this family who I read about on the previous slide, and they're needing food. It's famine, they are desperate. And for whatever reason they choose with their sons, with their family, to go to Moab because of the desperation. So the need was the food, and the response was to go to Moab. In chapter 2, Ruth comes into the story, and I don't want to. I'm trying not to do spoiler alerts here or spoilers here, but in chapter 2 we've got Ruth and Naomi working together, and they need food. So their response is Ruth goes into the fields. Chapter 3, they need a home, or Ruth needs a home. By this stage, they've moved back to Bethlehem, but Ruth is needing a home. So Naomi sends her to the threshing floor, which is where we get to meet Boaz. Spoiler alert there. But again, and then chapter 4, Naomi now needs a redeemer. She's got because her sons ended up dying, she has no children. She has no sons to then be marrying. She has no children. She has no one to sort of lead on and carry the name. And the response there is Boaz going to the city gate. So I'm hoping that if you've got a vague understanding of Ruth and what the story is about, it's just highlighting some of the key elements that go through. That there is somebody in need and there is a response given. There is someone in need and there is a response given. And it happens in all 4 chapters here. My title, my very first slide, even though I'm talking about the Book of Ruth, it's actually Naomi. Naomi, what a story. And Naomi happens to be the main character in each one of the 4 chapters we have here. The very first chapter talks about Naomi's emptiness. So she's moved to Moab with her husband, her 2 sons. They end up dying. She's in a country that really just she shouldn't be. Based on the Moabite history. So, the very first chapter talks a lot about Naomi's emptiness and where is she going and what is she doing and woe is me and what has happened. Chapter 2, there's an awakened hope there. Her daughter-in-laws, who happen to be Moabites, they offered to go back with her to Bethlehem, and Naomi initially says no, but the women do go with her for a part of the time. And Ruth is the one that actually sticks with her. So in the chapter 2, there is this sense of Naomi is actually not by herself. She's not alone. Chapter 3, as they move back to Bethlehem, and they're starting to, Boaz is starting to come into the picture. Naomi's hope is increasing. Her thoughts of possibly there is a future, and I'm not going to die a lonely woman with no heirs, no one caring for me. That continues in chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, we have the happy ending, and there is a marriage. And as I read in that previous verse, that a child is born. And that child is therefore that grandson of Naomi's. So the whole book of Ruth is actually a story about Naomi moving from emptiness in a foreign land and barrenness because her husband had died, her sons had died, there were no children born, to fullness as she returns back to Bethlehem and full inheritance through Boaz. Naomi's fulfilment also comes through Ruth, who is a Moabite woman. So straight out, based on the talk I was giving you about Moab and what they did, no one would have gone anywhere near a Moabite woman. Why would you with that sort of history? But Ruth just was not like that at all. And Naomi's fulfillment comes via a Moabite woman. And also via Boaz. Boaz, a little heads up, was an established and wealthy, upstanding Judah man. So he also, why would he marry a Moabite woman? Like, it's an amazing story of welcome and inclusion, and even though God is not mentioned directly, but God is in there. And you can see that God is in there, and God is weaving himself through the story. Both Ruth and Boaz are also responding to Naomi's desperate situation. And they are doing what they can for her. And obviously in the process they end up meeting and marrying and falling in love. I'm sure that was part of it. But having a baby and goodness and fulfillment came through it all. It was also in that towards the end of that chapter 4 that it's actually Naomi that does the naming of Obed. It's not Ruth. And for Naomi, if you're looking back at her, or for her, even her, looking back at her life, she could see that through Ruth and Obed, that Naomi herself is redeemed, that there is lineage and that there is hope restored. Now, I've given lots of spoiler alerts there, but what I'm going to do now, and hopefully this will work, if nothing else, I might have to resort to acting it out, so pray that this works well. I've got a little clip put together by a Bible Project, and they do, I think they do a really wonderful job at telling a story, or like putting the story out in cartoony form of a book of the Bible. And in doing so, they highlight some of the things that you're reading about at the beginning and somehow how they're connected towards the middle and towards the end. And this adds to my love for the Book of Ruth.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi the widow, Ruth the Moabite, and Boaz the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line: "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi. And she says, wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her, that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up, and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future. And that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The Book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Obed, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the Book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the Book of Ruth is all about.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. You may or may not be able to read that, but I just thought they mentioned about the genealogy of Jesus, and I think it's really important to point out where my blue arrows are that Boaz is mentioned, and then we get Obed and Jesse, and then we get David, King David, man after God's own heart, and then the lineage goes and leads us to Jesus. So part of Jesus' lineage includes a Moabite woman. His lineage actually includes lots of other people who you would not think should be there. But today I really want to focus on Ruth and how she, despite being a Moabite, with the history and the reputation of the Moabites, is part of Jesus' lineage. Now, Gary will go into more of each one of those chapters in the weeks to come, but something I'd like us to take from what I'm showing today is redemption. Naomi's redemption came via a Moabite woman. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? Many of the words that are part of Ruth, written in Hebrew, the words that have redemption as a root, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that word, they appear 23 times in Ruth, and each time it's mentioned, it's in regard to Naomi. Naomi is the understood object there, or the person there. So redemption for Naomi is heavily intertwined across all of Ruth. Naomi's needs were physical there. She obviously needed food. She obviously needed company. She needed people who loved her. And those people who responded to her were showing redemption to her. And their love was shown to her through their actions. They didn't sit her aside and say, Naomi, why did you come? You're really silly, or anything like that. They actually just met her needs, and they loved on her and provided food. And as we saw with Ruth, she was loyal to Naomi and stuck with her, left her own home country to go to, for her, a foreign country. The assumption also was that Moabite women, because of their history, they would have no access to the promises of God because they were Moabites. Moabite women were treated as outcasts and aliens and strangers. And yet Ruth becomes an heir to the covenant promises. There's trust, there's family ties, there's loyalty, there's friendship in this story of Ruth. And despite Naomi expressing anguish and grief and initially seeing the suffering of her suffering from God's hands, she received redemption and abundant restoration. Another point there is that she wasn't, I saw someone write, she was not a bitter whiner, but like Job, she was a portrait of suffering and redemption. So, what a woman was Naomi. What message can we take for us today? It's lovely to have a historical story, and it's lovely to see the story presented and that sort of thing. Boy meets girl and they live happily ever after. But so what? What impact is that for us today? If a Moabite woman can be part of Jesus' lineage, then I reckon there's a place there for us. I really do. We are also sinners, and therefore we have alienated ourselves from God. We are strangers, we don't have any right to relationship with God. God could turn his back on us, but he doesn't. He welcomes each and every one of us. And it doesn't matter where you're from, what you've done, where you're going, what your thoughts are. Your best is yet to come, and your past does not define your future. Ruth's past. Imagine, asking her, what were your parents and your grandparents, and, how did you come to settle in this country? Well, I had a king that sacrificed his son, and, I had other relatives that distracted Solomon. Oh my goodness, sorry, I don't want to talk to you. But oh my goodness, what sort of a woman was Ruth and Naomi? I just love this story. And we are all part of God's kingdom. And as stated in Matthew 28, I'm going to have to turn around because I can't read this properly. Therefore, this is from Jesus saying, therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptising them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you to the very end of the age. That is a message to us all, to go to all, not just to stay in our little holy huddles and cliques. So I reckon that straight out says we're all in there together. This is a picture I found from Vision Radio, and I've seen this written in many other different formats. But sometimes when you are in a dark place, you think you've been buried, but actually you've been planted. So, can I encourage you that doesn't matter where you are currently, how brave you feel, how strong you feel, how, hey, I've got it all together, I feel, or how I don't have it together, I'm faking it till I make it sort of thing. You are where you are meant to be. And if you keep your eyes on God, He will show you your next step. You might not know 10 steps away, 100 steps away, but He will show you the next step. And what you're currently struggling with now, like Naomi was, it's actually going to be turned and used for good. Those of you that have stories that feel you shouldn't be here and everyone's got it together and I haven't, or I'm going through trials and trauma and whatever, please stick with God, because I can guarantee you are not the first person to have gone through that. You won't be the last, but your experience can be shared with others to say, hey, I've done that, I've been there, and I've survived to tell the tale. So keep pressing on. Keep pressing on. And don't ever give up. And when you do think you're going to give up, think of Naomi and think of Ruth. Ruth, a Moabite woman with her history, and she's in Jesus' lineage. And Naomi, who thinks God has given her bitterness and tragedy, how God can use that tapestry of her life and turn it around for good. So, go well and go strong. As we launch into our last final song, if you guys ever feel that, while the music is happening, feel that you want prayer for anything, be it related to what I was talking about, if you are feeling rubbish, come and join me up the front. I can guarantee you, I'm telling you now, I've had weeks, I've had days, moments this week where I felt rubbish. So I'm going to join you up here for prayer. Okay? Just go well and go strong, and don't let go of God.